On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor in waves. Within 2 hours, they had sunk or damaged 19 American warships and destroyed nearly 200 aircraft. The attack claimed the lives of 2,403 Americans and wounded another 1,178. History often depicts this strike as sudden aggression by a militaristic empire bent on world domination. But that narrative is incomplete because it does not explain the real reason Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. That reason was not military ambition, but economic desperation. Because by late 1941, American, British, and Dutch embargoes had cut off nearly 90% of Japan's oil supply, and military stockpiles were draining month by month. Japanese planners calculated that within 18 months, their fleet would be immobilized. Faced with this timeline, Japanese leaders saw only two options: submit to American demands and withdraw from China, or gamble everything on a strike that might buy time to seize the oil fields of Southeast Asia. In the end, they chose to gamble. Yet, economic desperation was only part of the story. What follows reveals how a manufactured warrior code, a reluctant admiral who believed his own plan would fail, and catastrophic miscalculations on both sides combined to produce one of history's most consequential decisions. Section 1. The Economic Stranglehold. The crisis began in July 1939 when the United States gave notice that it would end the Treaty of Commerce and Navigation with Japan. This treaty had governed trade between the two nations since 1911, and its termination signaled that economic pressure was coming. Emperor Hirohito understood the danger immediately. The following month, in August 1939, he reportedly warned his military leaders that unless they reduced the army and navy by 1/3, Japan would not survive economically. However, his warning was ignored because the military continued to expand operations in China, consuming resources at an unsustainable rate. At the time, Japan imported nearly 90% of its oil, most of it from the United States and the Dutch East Indies. The embargoes then came in stages over the following year. In July 1940, the United States restricted exports of aviation fuel and scrap metal to Japan, and these materials were essential for aircraft production and military manufacturing. Then, in September 1940, Japan moved troops into northern Indochina, and the United States responded with a full embargo on scrap iron and steel. Each Japanese expansion triggered tighter economic restrictions in response. By summer 1941, the situation reached a breaking point. The decisive blow was about to fall, and it would force Japan into an impossible choice. On July 26, 1941, President Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the United States, which meant Japan could not purchase American oil without government approval. Then, on August 1st, the administration implemented a total oil embargo, and Britain and the Netherlands followed immediately by cutting off supplies from their colonial territories. As a result, Japan's oil imports dropped to nearly zero overnight, and the nation now measured its survival in months and barrels of oil. The military calculations that followed were stark. Prince Takamatsu, the emperor's younger brother and a naval officer, warned that Japan's oil reserves were reaching a critical point. The army estimated it had less than 2 years of oil stocks for its mechanized units, as historian Edward Drea has documented. The Navy's situation was even worse because without oil, the fleet would be immobilized within 18 months. Faced with these numbers, Japanese officials began describing their situation in terms of life and death. The question was no longer whether to act, but how. As historian Saburo Ienaga documented, Navy Ordnance Bureau Chief Okazaki Ayakoto compared Japan to a tuberculosis patient facing two choices: undergo a dangerous operation that might end badly, or continue wasting away until the outcome was certain. Japan could strike boldly for the oil fields of the Southern Pacific, or it could, in Okazaki's words, gasp along until it collapsed. Suzuki Teiichi, who served on the Cabinet Planning Board, put it simply: Japan went to war because its resources were insufficient. The embargoes had achieved their purpose because they had forced Japan to choose between humiliation and war. Economic desperation drove the decision for war. However, desperation alone does not explain why Japanese leaders believed they could succeed against the world's largest industrial power. That confidence rested on an ideology that had been carefully manufactured over the previous decade, and the warrior code presented as ancient samurai tradition was actually written by a novelist and a poet. Section 2. The Manufactured Warrior Code. The roots of Japan's warrior ideology stretched back decades. In 1876, the Meiji government had abolished the samurai class as part of Japan's rapid modernization. However, the warrior traditions that propagandists would later invoke were largely invented to serve the needs of a modern conscript army. As historian Edward Drea has observed, the supposed Bushido values of the Japanese military were modern myths that had about as much application to 20th century soldiers as European chivalry had to modern Western armies. The ideological campaign intensified during the 1930s. In 1937, the government published Kokutai no Hongi, or Cardinal Principles of the National Polity, which declared the emperor to be a living god and Japanese society to be superior to Western civilization. Another tract, Shimin no Michi, extended this ideology to civilians by teaching that individual Japanese existed only to serve the state and the emperor. By January 1941, the military formalized this ideology into official doctrine. What soldiers received was not ancient wisdom, but modern propaganda designed to make surrender unthinkable. That month, the Japanese army issued the Senjin-kun, or Field Service Code. This document instructed soldiers that they must never surrender and warned them not to shame themselves by being taken prisoner alive. The code presented this prohibition as rooted in ancient samurai honor, but in reality, the Senjin-kun was a modern propaganda document. It was ghostwritten by Shimazaki Tosun, a novelist, and Sato Sonosuke, a poet. Drea has noted that they filled it with rhetorical flourishes designed to inspire soldiers, not preserve tradition. This ideology produced a dangerous overconfidence among military leaders. Vice Admiral Onishi Takejiro developed what he called the doctrine of spiritual determination, which held that nothing was impossible if Japanese forces possessed sufficient fighting spirit. According to this belief, material disadvantages could be overcome through sheer will. This thinking would later lead Onishi to create the kamikaze program. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, who would plan the Pearl Harbor attack, reflected this ideology in his own way. But his philosophy revealed a critical tension between ideological fervor and practical thinking. Yamamoto believed that success required participants firmly determined to devote themselves to their task, even at the sacrifice of their lives. Yet, his philosophy was more practical than the Army's mysticism because he comprehended American industrial capacity firsthand from his years studying at Harvard and serving as naval attaché in Washington during the 1920s. This contrast between ideology and practicality appeared even within the Pearl Harbor planning staff. Lieutenant Ida Fusada told his pilots that if his aircraft was damaged, he would purposely crash into an American target, and he kept his word. When his plane was hit during the attack on December 7th, he dove into the hangar at Kaneohe Naval Air Station. Meanwhile, Commander Genda Minoru, the tactical genius behind the attack plan, rejected such thinking entirely. Genda had little of the usual Japanese preoccupation with sacrifice and maintained that he would not burst in on his ancestors without being called. The Japanese educational system reinforced this ideological rigidity at the expense of flexible thinking. Later on, Admiral Tomioka Sadatoshi observed that education focused on cramming facts into students' minds rather than encouraging individual thinking, which limited strategic flexibility among military planners. As a result, officers were trained to execute doctrine rather than question assumptions or adapt to unexpected circumstances. Still, the ideology did not penetrate as deeply as wartime propaganda suggested. When the war ended, the gap between rhetoric and reality became clear. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, only 22 of 1,501 generals took their own lives, which represented just 1.5% of the officer corps, as Drea documented in his research. The code that demanded sacrifice before dishonor was more rhetoric than reality for most military leaders. Throughout the war, the Army and Navy also remained divided by bitter institutional rivalries that weakened strategic coordination because these services competed for resources, guarded their plans from each other, and sometimes worked at cross purposes. Nevertheless, the rhetoric shaped decisions that would determine the fate of millions. The admiral who designed Pearl Harbor privately believed it would lead to Japan's destruction, and he threatened to resign if they did not let him try. Section 3. The Reluctant Architect. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku knew America better than almost any officer in the Japanese Navy. He had studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921, and he had served as naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. During those years, he traveled extensively across the United States, visiting oil fields in Texas and automobile factories in Detroit. He understood American industrial capacity in a way that few of his colleagues could grasp. By November 1940, Yamamoto had begun confiding his fears about a potential war with America. That month, he spoke with Baron Harada Kumao about what would happen if huge fires broke out in Tokyo and the city was completely destroyed 3 or 4 times. In that case, he said, he could not remain still. The admiral was already anticipating the destruction that American bombers would eventually bring to Japan. Despite these fears, Yamamoto pushed aggressively for the Pearl Harbor attack. In January 1941, he took the extraordinary step of bypassing the Naval General Staff entirely, and his actions showed that he believed Japan had no good options left. That month, Japan's top naval strategist wrote a remarkable letter to Navy Minister Oikawa Koshiro. He requested permission to personally command the attack on Pearl Harbor so that he might devote himself exclusively to his last duty to his country. This was not the language of a confident military leader, but instead the language of a man who believed Japan would ultimately lose the war. When Prime Minister Konoye Fumimaro asked how long Japan could fight the United States, the admiral gave his famous 6-month promise. He said that for 6 months to a year, he could run wild and win victory after victory. However, after that, he had no confidence at all, and he warned that a war with America would become prolonged and difficult, a conflict Japan could not win. The admiral's private correspondence during this period revealed even darker assessments. In August 1941, he wrote to Admiral Yoshida Zengo that the authorities in Tokyo believed war was unavoidable. Given that reality, he argued that Japan must deal the U.S. Navy a fatal blow at the outset of war because it was the only way she could fight with any reasonable prospect of success. When the Naval General Staff resisted his plan, Yamamoto threatened to resign. This threat was a potent trump card because he was the most respected admiral in Japan, and his resignation would have caused a political crisis. Chief of Staff Kusaka Ryunosuke confronted the admiral about the risks and called the operation a gamble. Yamamoto's response was telling. He declared that he liked games of chance, and since the operation was a gamble, he would carry it out. He saw no good options and chose the most aggressive one available. The admiral's original plan reinforced this assessment. He proposed that pilots attack Pearl Harbor and then ditch their aircraft at sea to be recovered by submarines, which showed he expected few of them to survive. Commander Genda rejected this idea on the spot, calling it defeatism, and the final plan called for pilots to return to their carriers. However, Yamamoto's initial concept revealed how dangerous he believed the mission to be. After the attack on December 7th, 1941, Yamamoto expressed regret about the decisions that had been made. He also worried deeply about how the strike would be perceived by the American public. When American broadcasts condemned Japan for attacking without warning, for striking while diplomats were still negotiating in Washington, the admiral called for an inquiry into what had gone wrong with the timing. He recognized that a sneak attack would inflame American opinion, and Japanese leaders had convinced themselves they could win in 3 months, even though the emperor had reminded them they had made the same promise about China 4 years earlier. By late 1942, Yamamoto's regrets had deepened further. He told Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo at Truk that events had shown it was a great mistake not to have launched a second attack against Pearl Harbor. He also harbored resentment toward Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi, who had commanded the strike force. The admiral never forgot Nagumo's original opposition to his plan and blamed him for the cautious decisions that limited the attack's effectiveness. Yamamoto believed Japan could not win a long war, but his warnings were ignored because Japanese leaders had convinced themselves that a quick victory was possible. Section 4. The Short War Illusion. Japanese leaders justified their war plans by pointing to history. Prime Minister Tojo Hideki invoked the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, reminding his colleagues that Japan had taken its stand with no prospect of victory, yet it won. However, that analogy was deeply flawed because Russia in 1905 had been weakened by revolution and was willing to negotiate, while the United States in 1941 was the world's largest industrial power and would demand unconditional surrender. The same flawed thinking had shaped Japan's approach to China. In 1937, at the outbreak of the China incident, military leaders had promised that fighting there would be settled in a short time. By September 1941, more than 4 years had passed, and the conflict remained unresolved. Yet Japanese planners were making the same promises again. In early September 1941, Army Chief of Staff Sugiyama Hajime briefed Emperor Hirohito on war plans and estimated that operations in the South Pacific could be completed in about 3 months. The emperor's response revealed how little he trusted such predictions. Hirohito reminded Sugiyama that, as war minister at the outbreak of the China incident, he had made the same promise about a quick resolution. When Sugiyama tried to explain that the Chinese hinterland was extensive and made operations difficult, the emperor cut him off. If the Chinese hinterland was extensive, Hirohito pointed out, then the Pacific was boundless. Navy Chief of Staff Nagano Osami witnessed this exchange, and he later recalled that he had never seen the emperor reprimand them in such a manner, with his face turning red as he raised his voice. Nagano attempted to justify the war plans with a medical analogy. He compared Japan to a sick patient facing a dangerous operation, admitting that the operation might be extremely dangerous. However, refusing the operation meant certain decline, while taking the risk would still offer some hope. This was the same argument that other officials were making because Japan had to gamble since the alternative was slow economic collapse. At an imperial conference on September 6, 1941, the question before Japan's leaders was not whether to fight, but when. The decision for war had essentially been made, yet the strategy behind it contained a fatal flaw. Plans called for establishing a strong military system after an initial offensive, one that would secure the resources of Southeast Asia and create a defensive perimeter too costly for Americans to penetrate. Yet by November 15, 1941, war planners had identified a critical assumption underlying the entire strategy, that Japan could create a solid defense after the first offensive. No long-term concrete plan for guiding the war through its later stages existed. Japanese leaders knew what to do in the first 6 months, but what came after remained undefined. A secondary fear also influenced Japanese calculations, though it was rarely discussed at the time. Some leaders worried that if Germany defeated Britain and the Soviet Union, Japan would be left out of the New World Order. German victory might give Berlin control over the colonial empires of France, Britain, and the Netherlands, and Japan might find itself surrounded by German-controlled territories with no access to the resources it needed. Acting quickly before the European War ended seemed essential to secure Japan's place among the great powers. Emperor Hirohito confirmed the flawed war plan, despite understanding its weakness. He knew that attacking without a long-term strategy would cause problems later when Japan needed to shift to defense. For decades afterward, the emperor's role in these decisions would be debated. Although Hirohito asked probing questions and expressed doubts, he ultimately approved the war and gave it the sacred sanction of the throne. His approval silenced remaining opposition within the government. Meanwhile, the Navy had conducted war games that predicted failure. Even after capturing the Dutch East Indies, these exercises showed that Japan could not keep the sea lanes open to its new territories. The Navy minister dismissed these results because leaders wanted optimistic assessments, not realistic ones. The war games had revealed a truth that no one wanted to hear. After the attack on December 7, 1941, Commander Fuchida Mitsuo assured Vice Admiral Nagumo that the main force of the U.S. Pacific Fleet would not be able to come out within 6 months. This assessment satisfied Nagumo because 6 months was exactly the timeline Japan needed to secure its objectives in Southeast Asia. However, this assessment ignored American industrial capacity and determination. Yamamoto believed the attack might produce a psychological shock that would paralyze the United States, and by sinking as many battleships as possible, he hoped to break the morale of the American people. Japanese planners went even further, assuming that Americans might consider the Japanese such a unique and fearless people that it would be useless to fight them. Japan's leaders had convinced themselves that a short war was possible, but they had no plan for what came after the first 6 months. What they also did not know was that American intelligence had intercepted a message that was essentially a bombing plan for Pearl Harbor, and nothing had been done with it. Section 5. Catastrophic intelligence failures. American intelligence failures before Pearl Harbor were systematic and devastating, and warnings had been accumulating for nearly a year before the attack. In January 1941, Navy Secretary Frank Knox wrote to Secretary of War Henry Stimson predicting a carrier-borne attack without warning prior to a declaration of war. 2 months later, on March 31, 1941, the Martin Bellinger Report predicted exactly how an attack on Hawaii would occur. It stated that the most likely and dangerous form of attack on Oahu would be an air attack launched from one or more carriers, which would probably approach within 300 miles. The report expected such an attack to be delivered as a complete surprise. American leaders knew an attack was possible, and they knew how it would likely occur, yet they failed to act on this knowledge. The most damning failure involved a specific intercept that arrived months later. On September 24, 1941, American codebreakers decrypted a Japanese message that divided Pearl Harbor into sub-areas and requested detailed information about which ships were located in each area. General Walter Short, commander of Army forces in Hawaii, later said this message was essentially a bombing plan for Pearl Harbor. But Washington never passed it to Short or to Admiral Husband Kimmel, the fleet commander. When Colonel Rufus Bratton urged that Hawaii be alerted, his superiors refused to act. Basic communication between commands had also broken down. Admiral Richmond Turner believed that Admiral Kimmel had access to magic decrypts, the decoded Japanese diplomatic messages, and he assumed Hawaii was receiving the information sooner than Washington. Admiral Lee Noyes, on the other hand, would never have confirmed that Pearl Harbor could translate all ciphers. Because neither man verified his assumption, crucial intelligence never reached the commanders who needed it most. Japanese intelligence failures during this period were equally consequential. As historian Herbert Bix has documented, Japanese calculations failed to account for the political factors that would determine the conflict's outcome. Emperor Hirohito came to believe that the war decision should ultimately be based on tactical and technical grounds, ignoring the broader political dynamics that would shape American resolve. During this same period, American intelligence officers who studied Yamamoto made contradictory assessments. Commander Edwin Layton told Admiral Kimmel that Yamamoto could win at poker among good poker players, recognizing the Admiral's willingness to take risks. Despite this observation, Layton still believed Japan could not afford to gamble too much, which underestimated the desperation driving Japanese decision-making. On November 27, 1941, a critical misrepresentation shaped the final decision for war. That day, Secretary of State Cordell Hull presented Japanese diplomats with a document outlining American demands. Marked tentative and carrying no time limit, this document left room for negotiation. Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori knew this but kept silent, as Bix documented, while Prime Minister Tojo misrepresented the Hull note to the cabinet as an ultimatum. This mischaracterization helped push Japan into war. During the attack itself on December 7, 1941, intelligence failures on both sides continued to shape events. Vice Admiral Nagumo and his Chief of Staff, Kusaka Ryunosuke, fretted over a possible counterattack from the American aircraft carriers that were not in port. This concern influenced Nagumo's decision against launching a third wave to destroy fuel storage and repair facilities. After the attack, Americans initially assumed the enemy had only one or two carriers at most. In the immediate aftermath, some even briefly credited Hitler with planning the operation because a thorough defeat by Japan alone seemed too humiliating to accept. Intelligence failures on both sides had shaped the attack and its aftermath. Now the consequences of Japan's miscalculation would become clear. Section 6. The final miscalculation. Before the attack, Vice Admiral Onishi had warned about what would happen if Japan struck Hawaii. He later recalled arguing that such an attack would make Americans so furious that any hope for a compromise peace would disappear. His warning was ignored because Japanese leaders had convinced themselves that a devastating blow would shock America into accepting a negotiated settlement. They misunderstood the nation they were attacking. On December 7, 1941, that miscalculation became clear almost immediately. The Pearl Harbor attack produced instant American unity, and historian Gordon Prange described a thread of relief that ran through the nation. Relief that Japan had taken the United States off the hook and made the decision for it. In a single morning, the bitter debates about whether to enter the war ended as the divide between isolationists and interventionists disappeared overnight. Government officials and newspapers alike expressed this same sentiment. Secretary of War Stimson wrote that his first reaction was relief that the indecision was over and that a crisis had come in a way that would unite all the American people. The New York Herald Tribune echoed this view, noting that since the clash now appeared to have been inevitable, its occurrence brought with it a sense of relief. With the air now clearer, Americans could get down to their task with old controversies forgotten. The following day, President Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech intensified American anger even further. By emphasizing that Japan had attacked while carrying on conversations with the United States, ostensibly in good faith, he generated widespread public outrage. The timing of events made this anger inevitable. 55 minutes elapsed between the start of the attack and the moment Secretary Hull received Japan's final diplomatic note, which meant the strike had begun while negotiations were still ongoing. When Japanese ambassadors Nomura Kichisaburo and Kurusu Saburo delivered their note, Hull responded with controlled anger and told them that in all his 50 years of public service, he had never seen a document more crowded with falsehoods and distortions. The State Department's assessment was blunt. The Japanese, in their own interest, had been exceedingly foolish in attacking Hawaii and thereby instantaneously and completely uniting the American people. Beyond the political miscalculation, the attack itself was incomplete. Nagumo's decision against a third strike wave was a strategic error of the first magnitude. Prang concluded that by failing to destroy the Pearl Harbor base, By failing to destroy Oahu's vast fuel stores and by failing to seek out and sink America's carriers, Japan committed its first and probably its greatest strategic error of the entire Pacific conflict. The fuel storage tanks were particularly critical. Admiral Kimmel observed after the attack that if the Japanese had destroyed the oil, which was all above ground at that time, it would have forced the withdrawal of the fleet to the coast because there was no oil anywhere else to keep operations going. The 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil at Pearl Harbor remained intact, and had they been destroyed, the Pacific War would have unfolded very differently because the Pacific Fleet would have been forced back to California, adding months to any American offensive. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who took command of the Pacific Fleet after the attack, understood what had been left undone. He observed that the fact that the Japanese did not return to Pearl Harbor and complete the job was the greatest help to the Americans. The attack had left their principal enemy with time to recover and rebuild. The aircraft carriers represented the most significant missed opportunity of all. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were all at sea on December 7th, and these carriers would form the backbone of American offensive operations over the next year. At the Battle of Midway, 6 months later, in June 1942, American carriers destroyed 4 Japanese carriers and turned the tide of the Pacific War. Nagumo's decision to withdraw without finding them proved to be a catastrophic error that shaped the rest of the conflict. Yamamoto's 6-month promise proved accurate. Japan ran wild until the Battle of Midway in June 1942, and after that, the tide turned irreversibly. Within 4 years, the empire that had launched the attack surrendered unconditionally on the deck of an American battleship in Tokyo Bay. The desperate gamble had failed, just as Yamamoto had predicted it would. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor brought America into the war and guaranteed an Allied victory in the Pacific. But Japan was not fighting alone. Their alliance with Nazi Germany meant that America's entry affected both fronts, and Hitler's war machine would soon face the same industrial power that overwhelmed Japan. To understand how that power brought down the Third Reich, watch this video next.